Hey everybody, it's Jesse, and today I want to show you the difference between React and React Native. Okay, so I get this question pretty frequently in my live streams and just from talking to people about React and React Native. So um, most people that ask the question usually know something about React, and they're wondering about React Native. It's more rare to find someone who's already learned React Native but hasn't used React. So I'm kind of going to take that approach of the majority and saying that you perhaps know something about React and you're going into React Native. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. If you don't know anything about React or React Native, then at least you'll have a better idea what they are, but I'm not going to go into an overview of exactly what React is. So this is just the differences, not in depth. I'm not going to go into like behind the scenes how they built the two things, React and React Native. This is more from a practical standpoint. Like when you're developing with React or React Native, what differences are you going to run into? What are you going to have to be aware of? All right, so the first big difference is why you would use React or React Native. So if you want to build a web app or a website that's going to run in a browser, you want to use React. If you would like to build something else that would run on a mobile device, you want to use React Native. Those are the main use cases for each one of these. React Native can also be run on other places. So technically, you could make a progressive web app with React, and it could run on a phone. And you could also make a website with React Native. So there's definitely some overlap there, but the majority use cases are React is for web, React Native is for mobile. But there's definitely other use cases that are available for both. So that aside, if you actually decide to start developing with them, these are the major differences that you're going to run into. So I made a little demo. Now these components would display, it should essentially display pretty much the same in React here on the left and React Native on the right. So this is probably the best way to figure out the differences, is just to see them in action. So basically, in both, we have a div that's 25 pixels high and 100 pixels wide, and it's displaying some text, like a little header and some text. All right, that's it. So we have I shouldn't say div because that's a web term. We have a container that displays some text. We have a certain width and height on the container, and we want the text to be stacked on top of each other, so that you have two lines of text, one on top of the other. Here's how you would achieve that in both, and we'll definitely see the differences there. So on the left, if you've ever done HTML, you said this pretty much looks like HTML with the exception of the styles here. So we use a div, we're using an H1 paragraph tag, the P tag, right? Very, very similar. In fact, in React, you could use everything that you can use normally in HTML. It works in React. React just gives you a lot of extra stuff to do more with that markup that you're familiar with from HTML. Okay. Now there is a little bit of a difference, right? We can add styles a little bit differently. So you notice our styles are actually a JavaScript object here, and we've instead of hyphenating them like you normally would in CSS, we've camel cased it. Right, so that's slightly different, okay, but for the most part, anything that you would normally be able to do with HTML will also be valid React code. Now on the other side of things, React Native, you can't use any HTML. So none of these tags will work in React Native. So instead of a div, we used a view. So as in HTML, a div is just kind of like a standard container that's you can do whatever you want with in terms of styling. A view is that in React Native. And in HTML, we have a variety of tags that we would use to put text in. So you could use H1, H2, H3 for all your different headers and so on. P tag for paragraph, right? And there's a lot of other tags that you might want to use to put text in that would determine, just in the HTML itself, it could give it a default styling, or it could kind of let the browser know what kind of text this is. In React Native, you just have text, right? So text is your tag, and you need to import these. They're not available by default. With React, these are all available by default, right? Because they're built into the browser. But React Native, we're taking the approach that we're not exactly sure where React Native is going to run, right? It could run on a variety of platforms. So these tags are all platform agnostic, whereas React is tied to the browser. React Native is not. So that's why it has its own tag. So you would use a text. Now notice here, I've used an H1. So if we really wanted this to look the same, I would have to get some type of styling to this text. Otherwise, these two blocks of text would look exactly the same. So you have to style. There's not this built-in styling in your text. Right? Now, you probably also notice that there's a difference in our CSS written as a JavaScript object. So there are several differences. The first we'll look at is in our units. So both have a width and height, but over here we're displaying the width and height as string values, and with pixels. Over here they're numbers, right? They're integer values, and they have no units. In React Native, we don't use units. So I decided to display pixels here, but this goes for anything like EM, REM, right? Any type of units you would normally use, you'd leave those off, right? So there are no units. Also, you notice I added a display flex. We're going to use flexbox in this case, and flex direction column. But I didn't need to add them here because by default, display, the CSS property display is set to flex by default in React Native, and flex direction by default is set to column. Okay, so that's different. In the browser, flex is not the default display, and if you decide to use flex, the default direction is row. All right, so this makes sense if you remember React Native is primarily for mobile, and a mobile phone, the screen is like portrait mode. Whereas on the web, if you're assuming that your user is on a desktop or a laptop, the view is going to be landscape mode, right? So it does make sense, but it is a little confusing if you're switching back and forth from web or from React to React Native, that your flex direction actually changes, your default flex direction. So in order to get the same layout where we have our text stacked here, we have to do display flex and flex direction column. Otherwise, this would default to flex direction row like a normal, like any normal browser-based website or app would do. Okay. Those are the primary CSS differences. There are some things in CSS that you can't do in React Native, but your browser should let you know if you're using React Native. It'll come up with a message, usually in the console, that'll say like, hey, you can't use this, or you'll just notice that the style doesn't work at all. Okay. The last thing that I want to mention that can be kind of a big deal if you need to use it is SVG. Right, scalable vector graphics. So like you could go into HTML and do SVG, and then inside your SVG you're gonna have I don't even remember what it's like, paths and stuff like that. So you're gonna have some different things in your SVG and probably like a bunch of numbers and letters in here, and that'll work in a browser. It will actually display an image just from this code. But if I tried to take this and put it into React Native, it would not work. Right? I would get an error. It will not recognize this. Okay, but I came in here and imported SVG and path from React Native SVG, which I don't have installed, so it's going to give me, but something like React Native SVG is a good package to use. I could actually turn this into a path and an SVG, right? And there are actually tools online where you can paste a normal SVG in and you'll get a React Native usable version of SVG. So it's essentially the exact same SVG code. It's just now, instead of using these DOM elements, by DOM I mean document object model that's in the browser, instead you're using these custom components that will be turned into what will look exactly the same when it comes to displaying to the user, but it'll be an SVG. Those are the main differences that I've run into over the last like 5 years or so of developing, first with React and then with React Native. These are not the only differences, but these are what you're going to run into the majority of the time. If you know, like, notice that none of the logic or state management is in here, and that's because all of that is the same. So if you know how to use state in React, you will know how to use it in React Native. If you know how to use hooks in React, they behave the same way in React Native. If you're going to use the context API, it'll work the same. If you're going to use Redux, it'll work the same. If you know how to use props, that'll work the same. What else? Render props, higher order components, all these React concepts that you may be used to either in React or React Native are interchangeable. All of that logic could be literally copy and pasted from a React project to a React Native project. And as long as it doesn't contain anything that of what we've touched on in this video, it should work. It should work fine. So don't be afraid to make the jump from one side to the other. Like I said, normally it's from React to React Native. So if you're good with React, don't worry about going to React Native. Now, one thing I didn't touch on, I think it's a little outside the scope of the video, is how would you run this project, right? How would you build it and run it? If you're coming from React, you may be used to using like Webpack, or maybe Create React App, which is the recommendation to start out with on the React documentation. And it kind of sets everything up for you. You can run it locally in your browser. It's very straightforward. If you go to React Native, it might be a little bit more difficult. I definitely recommend checking out Expo. That's EXPO. So type that out. I believe it's expo.io. Check that out. It basically does a very similar thing of what Create React App does in terms of scaffolding a project. And it also takes care of letting you preview your app either on your mobile device while you're working on it or in a simulator. Or you can even preview a React Native app in a browser for convenience. Or you could even bundle it as a website if you wanted to. So I recommend using Expo. It'll definitely, you don't have to, but it'll definitely make it easier for you if you're just starting out. And if you find that you really don't like Expo, you can always eject your app and do without it. If you start the app one way, you're not stuck with it the entire time. So let me know if you thought this video was helpful, or if you have any other questions. If you think I missed something big in the difference between React and React Native, let me know. I'm going to try to do a live stream tomorrow on Free Code Camp. So if you're watching this video on what's the date here? The 22nd. If you're watching this on March 22nd, I'll probably do a live stream sometime on March 23rd. Otherwise, if you're watching this later on, check out my live streams on Free Code Camp. They're on their YouTube channel. If you just type in live coding with Jesse into YouTube, you'll find a bunch of them. Or check out the other videos on my channel. And I'm recording this during the time of quarantine from the coronavirus. So everybody be safe. If anybody needs help, I can't physically give you help, obviously, but if anybody is having some real problems and needs something, feel free to reach out to me. All my social media stuff's linked in this channel. Send me a message, and if I can help, I will. Thanks so much for watching. Be safe, and I'll see you next time.